I'm going to show you how to use this assignment sheet to best organize the critical articles that you are going to employ in what will eventually be your critical positioning paper, because very often the senior seminar paper works well if you begin with just stating your thesis and what you want to accomplish in the paper, and then talking about what previous scholars have said about your topic. And sometimes that requires applying what other scholars have said about different books, but that have a similar theme or a similar concern that's in your argument. But this is to analyze an essay by a literary critic. This is not an analysis of a creative or even a creative nonfiction text. It is specifically by a literary critic. So that is something that you will create an MLA citation for. And in this particular case, the sample is a book, which is called a scholarly monograph by a woman named Carolyn Maber, and it's an entire book she wrote about Ralph Waldo Emerson, and she's focusing, it's not just about Emerson, it's about Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Louisa May Alcott on work in the women question. Obviously, you can see that from the title. The article that I would like you to consider today is the article that I have been assigned to analyze myself because, as I told you, I published an article in a journal that's online and has a pretty wide distribution. And I forgot the name of it again. It's that important. But anyway, I published an article in 2014 or 2015 about this author, Pauline Hopkins, and about her novel Winona. And then people started using more digital humanities studies to analyze Hopkins because Hopkins borrows a lot of her themes and characterizations and even lifts full sections from popular novels of the time into her own novels. So when people recognized that she was doing this, and I was one of the first people to recognize that she did it, so we were at a conference called the American Literature Association, and I was talking about how Emerson keeps popping up in, I think, Contending Forces, one of Hopkins' novels. So people heard that and started looking for better ways to dig around and find out what Pauline Hopkins was borrowing. And I think that actually people are using software like, you can use a function in Word where you can compare two texts and merge the texts, and you can see what's the same and what's different in two similar texts. So people use software like that to run Pauline Hopkins' Winona and then to run through Google Books and see where these other passages showed up in Google Books. So long story short, several people discovered that about 25% of each of her novels are directly or indirectly lifted from other popular novels of the time. But Pauline Hopkins is a radical race writer. She considered herself a daughter of the Revolution. So the question was, why does someone so interested in African American issues and African American politics borrow from popular novels by white writers who are either completely unconcerned with racial issues or who are sometimes racist? So this author is pursuing that question specifically in the case of Winona. So this article is not available online. This is PDF of a paper copy. It's from the College Literature Association Journal, the official publication of the College Language Association Journal. And you can get the information you need for the MLA citation all from the title page here of the journal. It is CLA Journal is the title of the journal. It's volume 59, number 2, and the author of the article is Joanne Pavletich. The article title is here, and then the page numbers 115 through 130 because the other one starts on 131. So that's just how you find the information for the MLA citation. And very often, if you find something through an online search, it's actually easier just to copy your bibliography from your search results, but then you always have to rearrange it so it'll be in MLA format and so it'll be correctly formatted. So I'm just going to type this in. So first you put the author. And do you usually use MLA format when you use critical articles?
I use MLA format for everything.
Okay, that's good. And I can't cut and paste this because it's a PDF, so I'm going to have to type it. We are going to take that right, Power and Plagiarism, and Pauline Hopkins Winona. And actually, I think this is a quote from within the novel. We are going to take that right. So I think that's why she has it not capitalized in her title. Oh, and Winona, because it is a novel, has to be italicized. But Word is being a little strange here. Okay.
What did you guys learn about English 101? What did you guys learn about in English 1? Did you guys go here for your English 1? English 101? Yeah.
I didn't take English 101. I had AP credit for it.
I remember everyone was complaining. We had a very rowdy class. I had it with Dr. Knight.
Oh, you had Dr. Knight.
Oh, wow, she doesn't teach 101 that much. That's unusual.
Well, I'm kind of glad she was, because when she introduced herself the first day, that's how I got involved in Writers Inc.
Right.
And that's literally the next day I was volunteering at the booth. And
Oh,
so-
cool.
We learned about composition, like
That's what I remember.
a media spectrum, like visual. Like we watched a bunch of movies in class, and we talked about movies a lot.
This was at
This is at Greenville
Sperner,
Tech.
Greenville Tech. Yeah, watching movies in class, I don't really understand.
Well, like
Because why can't you watch the movie outside of class and actually do things in class that you can't do by yourself? Because most people know how to watch a movie. You're not really learning something new.
But you like pause the movie to talk about certain elements in the film and like what makes these certain why did they do this close up on these flags this way, or why did they highlight her eyes
So
blue
you
with
did
the
rhetorical
contrast of the
analysis of
Right.
movies.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I feel like I didn't learn anything about anything else.
I would have found that helpful.
I just like right now I'm like confused as to what's the difference between a critical essay and any other essay that's about like stuff like that.
But you know why the flag is there in the movie.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so we'll see momentarily what a critical essay really looks like, and part of why this is a useful exercise, and I'm making the recording of it, and we're going over it in class, is that in the brain of the English department for what we want you to produce for your senior seminar essay, it's something like this thing that we're about to look at. Okay, we want you to write something that looks like a professional article written in the field.
Okay.
So I have just changed the MLA citation, that's the first step, and I use the title page of the article to do that. And now we're going to scroll down a little bit and look at the actual article. So this article is deceptively simple, because it appears that in the first sentence of the article we have the argument. By current academic standards, Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins was a plagiarist. That sounds like a good debate point, right? Everybody argue, was she a plagiarist or was she not? Do we call this plagiarism when you choose 25% of somebody else's work and plug it into your novel and don't attribute it whatsoever? Yeah, that technically is plagiarism. That's not actually a debatable point. But within literature and creativity, it's almost like sampling in music. There is intertextuality. It is a common practice to borrow. Now, Hopkins' borrowings are really excessive, and plagiarism was a topic of concern during her lifetime. And she was an editor of a magazine, so she must have known the rules about this. So part of the question is, well, why did she do it? And especially, like I mentioned before, why did she plagiarize popular white writers who either didn't care about race or were somewhat racist? So Pavlitic has a theory about this, and it is a theory that she invokes Jeffrey Sanborn's work to support. So like I said, probably in 2012 or so at an American Literature Association conference, I happened to mention that one of Hopkins' novels has huge chunks of Emerson's speeches. So people started talking about that. Jeffrey Sanborn in 2015 analyzed Hopkins' last novel, Of One Blood, and found examples and elements from 28 other texts, which were primarily popular novels and short stories that we aren't familiar with today. So she found that, Pavlich then found that 25% of the material in Winona comes from other novels and is similarly plagiarized. But notice how she mentions Sanborn here, because Jeffrey Sanborn is a well-known in English professor circles critic, and he's written books and he's published several articles. So when she says, hey, Jeffrey Sanborn did this, now I'm going to do something similar, she is gaining credibility for her argument. So that's part of the reason that we look for other sources that don't necessarily have to say exactly what we want to say, or who we don't have to necessarily disagree with, but who are doing something similar, so we can say this is within the conversation of what literary criticism looks like. So Jeffrey Sanborn, she says, did this for Of One Blood, and so I'm going to do this for Winona. And then she quotes Sanborn directly and summarizes his critical perspective. So he uses Barth and Bakhtin, which she says is a very appropriate, voice or appropriate theoretical apparatus to look at this particular novel. But she's saying now what I'm going to do is a little different, because the distinct character types and politically aggressive tone and subject matter of Winona require a more political analysis that I'm going to offer in this essay. So she says, Bakhtin and Barth are great. It's great to do this more kind of linguistic or close reading analysis, but I want to think about the politics of what she's doing. So she sets up Sanborn as an authority and says, okay, good job, Jeffrey, but I'm going to do this a little differently. And that kind of move is the kind of move that you want to make early in your papers too. You just kind of pull somebody who's done something kind of similar, who's an English professor, and then say, but here's what I'm going to do, and this is how it's going to be a little different, because that shows what you're adding to the conversation. So this move that she makes, I think, is a really useful kind of move to think about. If you think about this as a playbook, a book of football plays. Who watches football? Yeah, David, okay. Victoria, or any sport that you like. Do you watch any sports, Nina?
Footy, soccer.
Okay. So there's plays in soccer too. And there's
Sometimes-
particularly those tricky plays where you pretend like you're going to fix the ball, the Pele move, where you're going to fix the ball for the penalty kick, but then you actually kick it and the goalie doesn't know you're actually going to kick. Little tricks like that and strategies are what we're looking for here. Question?
I was just going to say, sometimes I'm forced to watch cricket.
And who the hell knows what that's about? I just read something about cricket
I know about cricket.
that suggests that cricket is really political. Oh, it was about C.L.R. James and cricket, and about the politics and the history and the heritage that makes cricket almost like an epic text.
It's extremely political.
Yeah.
Extremely.
And kind of built-in tradition and standard moves and things like that. So, yeah, you can use cricket. We'll use football or soccer, and think of this as a playbook. But still, when you're reading critical articles, you also have to break them up into chunks. So I actually suggest in the instructions that you should read through the whole thing before you try to determine what the argument is. But generally, you'll find the argument within the first 4 paragraphs. So the instructions say to read the whole thing first, but it can be difficult to read these things as an entire text, because they're going on for 17 pages about some minute particular, and it might not be useful. So if you break it into chunks, you read the introductory section first, you find out what the argument is, then you look for more interesting developments of that argument in later sections and chunks of the article. So have you ever done reading in chunks before? Rather than trying to read like a whole entire article or a whole short story or a whole novel? Chapters are one example of how we read in chunks, and things should be broken up,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, if we've read anthologies, then I'm pretty sure we've read in chunks.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but even of one particular text, you just kind of read parts of it. Excerpts
Right.
are a good example of looking at things in chunks. Well, critical articles need to be read in chunks too. So the first 4 paragraphs or so are usually the first important chunk, where it tells you this is what the critical conversation is, somebody else important has said this, I'm going to say it a little differently, and then I'm going to tell you what my particular argument is. So she says that Hopkins performs a muscular manipulation of text as her own form of political conquest, with literature as her weapon and plagiarism as a strategy. That sounds like a thesis statement, right? And I would agree that here she is setting up her thesis. Then again, she backs it up. She goes to an historical source here, which is Victoria Earle Matthews, an African-American writer from the turn of the century, in a well-known 1895 speech, The Value of Race Literature, where she tells African-Americans to see literature as a weapon in the fight for justice, and to awake to, quote, the fact that our task is a conquest for a place for ourselves, and literature is a legitimate ground of action for us if we shall resolve to conquer it. So that's kind of also an example, David, of how you could think about plugging in a Machiavelli quote to set up your thesis in your paper. Because this is actually, she's not referring here to a scholar, she's referring to an historical source, kind of an historical figure or source who is in the similar time period or who would have been influential in that time period to back up her argument. So African American literature as conquest, and kind of setting up the practice of African American writing as a way to appropriate or conquer other words. And Hopkins called herself the daughter of the Revolution, so she's further setting up her argument that Hopkins is like in battle here. She's going to battle, and she's kind of like colonizers will go and plant their flag and, you know, create and take over a colonial area and inflict their culture on it. Mm-hmm. Hopkins is doing something similar, but what she's doing is she's colonizing the white literature, and she's repurposing it to have a racial argument that to her is progressive and radical. So toward the end of, I guess in this case, the third paragraph, we get another articulation of Pavlich's argument. By appropriating or conquering others' words and giving them new meanings, this essay argues, Hopkins claimed the right to take provocative action to explode racist assumptions, promote justice for African Americans, and expand possibilities for the representation of black female agency. So there's a kind of a three-part argument of why Hopkins is plagiarizing. She's claiming a right, she's appropriating, she's conquering. We've moved away from the word plagiarizing. And then she goes back to talk a little bit about the concept of borrowing in literature, and this is a little bit more of a literary periods and traditions part of her argument. So she's also covering, you know, invoking other scholars with Sanborn, it's invoking the historical context with Victoria Earle Matthews, with what Hopkins herself says about revolution, and now not only invoking the historical context, but also the literary periods and movements of the 19th century in which people borrowed and quoted and repurposed literature from other sources quite often. So here is an essay on psychology of plagiarism by William Dean Howells from 1902. The world is full of idle people reading books. To act as glad detectives. You have no safety in the obscurity of the author from whom you take your own. So he disapproves of the practice and says people only do it when they're hard-pressed for ideas. Samuel Clemens was appalled by the practice, but Pavlich is saying here that Pauline Hopkins is not making shortcuts. She's not plagiarizing because she doesn't have anything creative to say. She's plagiarizing very creatively in this kind of conquest metaphor. So again, she's using what was happening in that literary movement of realism at that time, where people were really against plagiarism, to say, oh, but Hopkins is doing something innovative within that movement in this idea of literary conquest. So we've covered some of those main topics already. And then she identifies 15 sources in Winona, so that's kind of like a good example of close reading and analysis. But anyway, when you're doing the critical article outline, you want to put in the author's argument verbatim. So does somebody want to read that to me? I argue, the part where she says I argue, that I just read to you from the end of paragraph 3. I know you can't see it here. Let's see, because if you read it to me, I can type it faster. Okay. Here we go. Because I'm just showing you now how to put this stuff directly into the assignment by appropriating or conquering. So, because if I try to look back and forth to copy it, it's going to go crazy because I'm dyslexic. So if you read it to me, I can type it.
Oh, we're conquering others' words and giving them new meanings. This essay argues, or comma, this essay argues, comma. Hopkins claimed the right to take provocative action. To explode racist assumptions, comma, promote justice for African Americans, comma, and explain or expand possibilities for the representation of Black female agency.
Oh, what's the page number again? 116? I think that's what it is. I'm just going to put it in. I can always fix it later. Notice how much more quickly I can type when someone reads it to me rather than when I'm trying to look back and forth and my mind is turning everything inside out and upside down. So then, in our own words, what does that mean? Let me open this up. It's more visible what I'm doing. Okay, so I just typed that. But this is, and this kind of restating of the thesis, I've pulled in a few other ideas, not just the idea at the end of paragraph 3, but also the idea from the literary time period and movement. So while her contemporaries such as William Dean Howells and Mark Twain might have seen borrowing 25% of words from other people for your novel as plagiarism, Hopkins is actually making a revolutionary literary move by conquering and appropriating the deracialized or sometimes racist prose of her popular contemporaries to further her radical political agenda. Now, when you're writing the introduction for your paper, you can actually pull things directly out of this outline and plug into your introductory paragraphs. Because everything is scaffolded in the assignments, so therefore everything that you write, you can move into your paper. That is not plagiarism. That is encouraged. It's kind of, building up the paper in smaller pieces. So the next part we need to do is determine what the parts of the argument are. And I'm only going to do one of these because I don't want to bore you to death. So in her sections, Pavlitich mostly, I'll show you what she does in just a second. She mostly discusses different books that Hopkins borrowed from extensively. And notice here we see a lot of quotations and a lot of references to other sources. And she also has a lot of footnotes. So of the 15 sources identified in Winona, 4 served as especially important resources for the development of her heroine. And so she's going to talk first in her sections about the Catherwood novel, The White Islander. So she then does this, and this is something that you also, if you're writing about a novel or a play, or you've chosen a particular text, or if you're writing about your own story about friendship dolls, this is a really good example of how to familiarize, and this at this particular point where you start going into your major sections of the parts of your argument, this is a good example of how to not summarize and over-explain your primary source, but to familiarize your audience with the source. So this is her kind of plot summary of Winona, just so that we're familiar with the text that she's focusing on. Opens in an idyllic multicultural border community in Lake Erie in the mid-1850s with a mixed community. Winona is raised in this community, and she's the mixed-race daughter of a British aristocrat who fled England because he was wrongly accused of murdering his brother, and an escaped slave who brings Judah, the infant of another escaped slave who died en route to freedom, into the marriage. So it was just Winona and her brother Judah. Their mother dies when they're young. Their father takes the name White Eagle. He's an English aristocrat who takes on a Native American identity and raises 2 black children. So clearly Hopkins has something going on here, because nothing like this happens in Catherwood's original novel. Mm-hmm. She takes a popular novel and makes it this race melodrama in really complex and insane ways. And I remember when I was trying to talk about a Hopkins novel at my dissertation defense, one of my dissertation advisors said, "But wait a minute. Why do you choose novels that have these crazy, unrealistic plots?" But actually, I don't think this plot is completely unrealistic, because I think passing for white or passing for another racial identity were really common in this time period. Mm-hmm. And by complicating the racial politics here, in making it a family, Hopkins is suggesting that the American family is really very multiracial and very conflicted, and kind of giving examples of how the American family could be less dysfunctional, perhaps. So anyway, she continues here with this full summary of the novel and manages to explain in one somewhat long paragraph a whole entire novel. So you don't want to do more than one thorough paragraph touching on the most important points in your source, in your own paper, but that is another facet you will include in your paper. So her first section here is particularly the foundational plotline coming from Mary Hartwood Catherwood's The White Islander. This is section 1. The next section, and here she has a chart where she actually has a direct comparison of 2 different, of the source from The White Islander and the source from Winona. And you can see it's almost identical. You know, Hopkins is really blatantly plagiarizing, but everything else about the story is really critically changed and redone. So then Pavlitich does some analysis about this and some close reading about this particular 2 sections. So the symbolically evocative cavern, the loss of time, the sweet stupor of this passage all suggest orgasmic activity that explodes in a cry for the beloved's return. There's some close reading. There's some good old English professor reading sex into everything. It's about orgasm. It's about longing for your lover. And she doesn't go into extensive explanation of how these 2 passages are orgasmic or about longing, but that is certainly something that you could do in your senior seminar paper. She doesn't do a lot of close reading in this particular article, but this article is more of a political bringing to light this issue of plagiarism. But in your actual senior seminar paper, you are going to want to do more close reading. So if you said something like, you know, if you're talking about the aura of sexual passion, you have to pull out the keywords that are sexual. Impulse, wild things, you know, hiding in a hole. I don't know to what extent you have to actually point out that that is some kind of Freudian or even Platonic metaphor for sexuality in the body. We did have a senior seminar presentation in which the presenter said clitoris, but pronounced it clitoris approximately 15 times, and it wasn't my favorite presentation.
Oh, God.
But if you pull out the words here, a sweet stupor, you know, that moment where you have to have a cigarette. I assume you know what I'm talking about. Rapture, passion, muscles knotted, a forceful cry projected through space. You know, if you've ever seen When Harry Met Sally, you recognize all of these descriptions as an orgasmic description. So you can do something more simple with pulling out specific language. And again, you don't have to have an orgasmic description. I'm just pausing here to talk a little bit about close reading and how you pull out keywords to perform the close reading part of your text. Pavlitich here doesn't go into extensive close reading. But in this first section, I think if we back up to where she introduces Catherwood's novel, that is a good description of the first section. Hopkins derived the foundational plotline for Winona from Catherwood's The White Islander. So within this breakdown here, we can look at the first section, and this is going to be like page 118 through, let's say, 123-ish, because sections are usually 118 to 122. The sections you will find are usually about 4 pages. And sometimes they actually have headers and subheaders so that you can break up the sections even more easily. And you might find that you only want to read chunks of an article in certain sections and kind of ignore others because they're either completely in crazy talk or they're not at all relevant to what you're trying to accomplish. So in this example, the first section is 122. It has a literature review and a little talk about some other scholars and the time period. She's not going to talk a lot about other scholars here because what she's talking about is more of a discovery that other people have not talked about before, but she did invoke other historical, literary period, and a few scholars' names early in the article. So it begins with lit review, description of plagiarism, the realist movement, and then a brief plot summary. Before she analyzes the similarities between Catherwood's The White Islander and Winona. So then, to explain the section, I would probably say she does a little bit of close reading where she places text from each novel side by side. And then I would quote her here with that whole orgasmic comment. And Brittany, I'm going to have you read that to me again when we go back to it. Okay. So here's where we're going to quote. So can you read the symbolically evocative to me?
Yeah, the symbolically evocative cavern, comma, the loss of time, comma, and the, in quotations, sweet stupor. Should I say that correctly?
Oh, that's it. And when you quote something within a quote, sweet stupor.
Stupor.
Yeah, when you quote something within a quote, you put it in a single quotation mark, which is actually just an apostrophe, which is weird, but that's what you do.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that's what I just did there. Let's see. And the sweet stupor, yes?
Stupor. Oh, I can't see it.
Oh, you
now.
can't see it now, sorry.
It's okay. Of this passage.
Oh, wait a second. Oh, I can't see what I'm doing now either. I don't know why I can't move this around either.
Is it just a moment?
It's stuck, yeah. Okay. I'm just going to type it here. The sweet stupor.
Of this passage. All suggest orgasmic activity that explodes in a cry for the beloved's return. Do you want me to keep going?
No, that's enough.
Okay.
What page is that? Let's see, it's 120. Whoops, so you close the quote. Actually, in a block quote, you don't put quotation marks, but this is something that's short enough. If you were going to plug it into your text, you would have it in quotation marks. So I'm just going to put it that way. All right, so that's enough of that. Let's save this. And because I think that also when you save things, you might want to have a folder for your senior seminar paper and just like do article analysis, Pavlitich, so you know which author you've put in your information from, and then kind of go through and do the other sections. So in this, I have, again, the sections are from, with a couple of quotes, with kind of, this is what the section is about, this is a paraphrase of what happens in the section, and here's a few quotes. Because as you talk about each section of the article that you want to talk about, you kind of want to go through, paraphrasing the argument, summarizing the argument, paraphrasing the argument, and then directly quoting the argument. That's how you engage with a critical text. So I have done that in this first example, summarize, paraphrase, and then directly quote. And of course I would use signal phrases and incorporate this into my paragraph a little bit more, but hopefully this is a clear explanation for you about how to utilize another critic's work to plug into your argument. And then obviously we haven't talked yet about how to take this and incorporate into your argument. When we do the critical positioning, then I will explain to you how I would take this work and transfer it into my own argument and start writing my own paper, which is Rethinking Winona, because the woman who wrote this article asked me to do it and keeps asking me. And just like all of you, I have been encroached on to write a paper against my will. Let's see, where's QuickTime? I just have to quit to make it stop. And this is called article analysis.